Sooner or later, somehow, anyhow, I was bound to write a novel. It seems vain to ask why. Men are born with various manias. From my earliest childhood, it was mine to make a plaything of imaginary series of events. And as soon as I was able to write, I became a good friend to the paper makers. Rathalet was attempted before age 15, the vendetta at 29, and the succession of defeats lasted unbroken till I was 31. By that time I had written little books and little essays and short stories, and had got patted on the back and paid for them, though not enough to live upon. I had quite a reputation. I was the successful man. I passed my days in toil, the futility of which would sometimes make my cheek burn, though. That I should spend a man's energy upon this business, and yet could not earn a livelihood. And still there shone ahead of me an unattained ideal. Although I had attempted the thing with vigor not less than 10 or 12 times, I had not yet written a novel. All my pretty ones had gone on for a little and then stopped, like a schoolboy's watch. I might be compared to a cricketer of many years' standing who should never have made a run. Anybody can write a short story, a bad one I mean, who has industry and paper and time enough, but not everyone may hope to write even a bad novel. It's the length that kills. The accepted novelist may take his novel up and put it down, spend days upon it in vain, and write not any more than he makes haste to blot. Not so the beginner. Human nature has certain rights. Instinct, the instinct of self-preservation, forbids that any man, cheered and supported by the consciousness of no previous victory, should endure the miseries of unsuccessful literary toil beyond a period to be measured in weeks. There must be something for hope to feed upon. The beginner must have a slant of wind. A lucky vein must be running. He must be in one of those hours when the words come and the phrases balance of themselves, even to begin. And having begun, what a dread looking forward is that until the book shall be accomplished. For so long a time, the slant is to continue unchanged, the vein to keep running. For so long a time you must keep at command the same quality of style. For so long a time your puppets are to be always vital, always consistent, always vigorous. I remember I used to look, in those days, upon every 3-volume novel with a sort of veneration, as a feat, not possibly of literature, but at least of physical and moral endurance and the courage of Ajax. In the fated year of writing Treasure Island, I came to live with my father and mother at Kinnaird in Scotland. Then I walked on the red moors and by the side of the golden burn, the rude, pure air of our mountains, inspirited if it did not inspire us, and my wife and I projected a joint volume of logic stories, for which she wrote The Shadow in the Bed, and I turned out Thrawn Janet in the first draft of The Merry Men. I love my native air, but it doesn't love me, and the end of this delightful period was a cold, a fly blister, and a migration by Strath Airdle and Glenshee to the Castleton of Braemar. There it blew a good deal and rained in a proportion. My native air was more unkind than man's ingratitude, and I must consent to pass a good deal of my time between 4 walls, in a house lugubriously known as the late Miss McGregor's cottage, and now admire the finger of predestination. There was a schoolboy in the late Miss McGregor's cottage, home from the holidays, and much in want of something craggy to break his mind upon. He had no thought of literature. It was the art of Raphael that received his fleeting suffrages, and with the aid of pen and ink and a shilling box of watercolors, he had soon turned one of the rooms into a picture gallery. My more immediate duty towards the gallery was to be showman, but I would sometimes unbend a little, join the artist, so to speak, at the easel, and pass the afternoon with him in a generous emulation, making colored drawings. On one of these occasions, I made the map of an island. It was elaborately, and I thought beautifully colored. The shape of it took my fancy beyond expression. It contained harbors that pleased me like sonnets, and with the unconsciousness of the predestined, I ticketed my performance, Treasure Island. I'm told there are people who don't care for maps, but find it hard to believe. The names, the shapes of the woodlands, the courses of the roads and rivers, the prehistoric footsteps of man still distinctly traceable uphill and down dale, the mills, the ruins, the ponds and the ferries, perhaps the standing stone or the druid circle on the heath. Here is an inexhaustible fund of interest for any man with eyes to see or twopence worth of imagination to understand with. No child but must remember laying his head in the grass, staring into the infinitesimal forest and seeing it grow populous with fairy armies. Somewhat in this way, as I paused upon my map of Treasure Island, the future character of the book began to appear there, visibly, among imaginary woods. And their brown faces and bright weapons peeped out upon me from unexpected quarters as they passed to and fro, fighting and hunting treasure, on these few square inches of a flat projection. The next thing I knew, I had some papers before me and was writing out a list of chapters. How often have I done so, and the thing gone no further? But there seemed elements of success about this enterprise. It was to be a story for boys. No need of psychology or fine writing, and I had a boy at hand to be a touchstone. Women were excluded. I was unable to handle a brig, which the Hispaniola should have been, but I thought I could make shift to sail her as a schooner without public shame. And then I had an idea for John Silver, from which I promised myself funds of entertainment, to take an admired friend of mine, whom the reader very likely knows and admires as much as I do, to deprive him of all his finer qualities and higher graces of temperament, to leave him with nothing but his strength, his courage, his quickness, and his magnificent geniality, and to try to express these in terms of the culture of the raw tarpaulin. Such psychic surgery is, I think, a common way of making character. Perhaps it is, indeed, the only way. We can put in the quaint figure who spoke 100 words with us yesterday by the wayside, but do we know him? Our friend, with his infinite variety and flexibility, we know. But can we put him in? Upon the first, we must engraft secondary and imaginary qualities, possibly all wrong. From the second, knife in hand, we must cut away and deduct the needless aberrations of his nature. But the trunk and the few branches that remain, we may at least be fairly sure of. On a chill September morning, by the cheek of a brisk fire, and the rain drumming on the window, I began The Sea Cook, for that was the original title. I have begun and finished a number of other books, but I cannot remember to have sat down to one of them with more complacency. It is not to be wondered at, for stolen waters are sweet. I am now upon a painful chapter. No doubt the parrot once belonged to Robinson Crusoe. No doubt the skeleton is conveyed from Poe. I think little of these. They are trifles and details, and no man can hope to have a monopoly of skeletons or make a corner in talking birds. The stockade, I am told, is from Masterman Ready. It may be. I care not a jot. These useful writers had fulfilled the poet's saying. Departing, they had left behind them footprints on the sands of time. Footprints which perhaps another, and I was the other. It is my debt to Washington Irving that exercises my conscience, and justly so, for I believe plagiarism was rarely carried farther. I chanced to pick up the Tales of a Traveler some years ago, with a view to an anthology of prose narrative, and the book flew up and struck me. Billy Bones, his chest, the company in the parlor, the whole inner spirit, and a good deal of the material detail of my first chapters, all were there. All were the property of Washington Irving. But I had no guess of it then, as I sat writing by the fireside, in what seemed the spring tides of a somewhat pedestrian inspiration, nor yet day by day after lunch as I read aloud my morning's work to the family. It seemed to me original as sin. It seemed to belong to me like my right eye. I had counted on one boy. I found I had two in my audience. My father caught fire at once with all the romance and childishness of his original nature, his own stories that every night of his life he put himself to sleep with, dealt perpetually with ships, roadside inns, robbers, old sailors, and commercial travelers before the era of steam. He never finished one of these romances. The lucky man did not require to. But in Treasure Island, he recognized something kindred to his own imagination. It was his kind of picturesque. And he not only heard with delight the daily chapter, but set himself acting to collaborate. When the time came for Billy Bones's chest to be ransacked, he must have passed the better part of a day preparing on the back of a legal envelope an inventory of its contents, which I exactly followed. And the name of Flint's old ship, the Walrus, was given at his particular request. And now who should come dropping in, ex machina, but Dr. Japp, like the disguised prince who was to bring down the curtain upon peace and happiness in the last act. For he carried in his pocket not a horn or a talisman, but a publisher, had in fact been charged by my old friend Mr. Henderson to unearth new writers for young folks. Even the ruthlessness of a united family recoiled before the extreme measure of inflicting on our guest the mutilated members of the sea cook. At the same time, we would by no means stop our readings, and accordingly the tale was begun again at the beginning, and solemnly redelivered for the benefit of Dr. Japp. From that moment on, I have thought highly of his critical faculty, for when he left us, he carried away the manuscript in his portmanteau. Here then was everything to keep me up: sympathy, help, and now a positive engagement. I had chosen, besides, a very easy style. Compare it with the almost contemporary Merry Men. One reader may prefer the one style, one the other. 'Tis an affair of character, perhaps of mood, but no expert can fail to see that the one is much more difficult and the other much easier to maintain. It seems as though a full-grown, experienced man of letters might engage to turn out Treasure Island at so many pages a day and keep his pipe alight. But alas, that was not my case. 15 days I stuck to it and turned out 15 chapters. And then, in the early paragraphs of the 16th chapter, I lost my hold. My mouth was empty. There was not one word of Treasure Island in my bosom. And here were the proofs of the beginning already waiting me at the Hand and Spear. Then I corrected them, living for the most part alone, walking on the heath at Weybridge in dewy autumn mornings, a good deal pleased with what I had done, and more appalled than I can depict to you in words at what remained for me to do. I was 31. I was the head of a family. I had lost my health. I had never yet paid my way, never made 200 pounds a year. My father had quite recently bought back and canceled a book that was judged a failure. Was this to be another and last fiasco? I was indeed very close on despair, but I shut my mouth hard, and during the journey to Davos, where I was to pass the winter, had the resolution to think of other things and bury myself in the novels of M. de Boisgobey. Arrived at my destination, down I sat one morning to the unfinished tale, and behold, it flowed from me like small talk, and in a second tide of delighted industry, and again, at a rate of a chapter a day, I finished Treasure Island. It had to be transcribed almost exactly. My wife was ill. The schoolboy remained alone of the faithful, and John Addington Symonds, to whom I timidly mentioned what I was engaged on, looked on me askance. He was at that time very eager I should write on the characters of Theophrastus. So far out may be the judgments of the wisest men. But Symonds, to be sure, was scarce the confidant to go to for sympathy on a boy's story. He was large-minded, a full man, if there was one, but the very name of my enterprise would suggest to him only capitulations of sincerity and solecisms of style. Well, he was not far wrong. Treasure Island, it was Mr. Henderson who deleted the first title, The Sea Cook, appeared duly in the story paper, where it figured in the ignoble midst, without woodcuts, and attracted not the least attention. I did not care. I liked the tale myself, for much the same reason that my father liked the beginning. It was my kind of picturesque. I was not a little proud of John Silver also, and to this day rather admire that smooth and formidable adventurer. What was infinitely more exhilarating, I had passed a landmark, I had finished a tale, and written the end upon my manuscript, as I had not done since the Pentland Rising, when I was a boy of 16, not yet at college. In truth, it was so by a set of lucky accidents. Had not Dr. Japp come on his visit? Had not the tale flowed from me with singular case? It must have been laid aside like its predecessors, and found a circuitous and unlamented way to the fire. Purists may suggest it would have been better so, but I am not of that mind. The tale seems to have given much pleasure, and it brought, or was the means of bringing, fire and food and wine to a deserving family in which I took an interest. I need scarcely say I mean my own. But the adventures of Treasure Island are not yet quite at an end. I had written it up to the map. The map was the chief part of my plot. For instance, I had called an islet Skeleton Island, not knowing what I meant, seeking only for the immediate, picturesque. And it was to justify this name that I broke into the gallery of Mr. Poe and stole Flint's pointer. And in the same way, it was because I had made 2 harbors that the Hispaniola was sent on her wanderings with Israel Hands. The time came when it was decided to republish, and I sent in my manuscript and the map along with it to Messrs. Cassell. The proofs came, they were corrected, but I heard nothing of the map. I wrote and asked. I was told it had never been received, and I sat aghast. It is one thing to draw a map at random, set a scale in one corner of it at a venture, and write up a story to the measurements. It is quite another to have to examine a whole book, make an inventory of all the allusions contained in it, and with a pair of compasses, painfully design a map to suit the data. I did it, and the map was drawn again in my father's office, with embellishments of blowing whales and sailing ships, and my father himself brought into service a knack he had of various writing and elaborately forged the signature of Captain Flint and the sailing directions of Billy Bones. But somehow it was never Treasure Island to me. I have said the map was the most of the plot. I might also say it was the whole of it. A few reminiscences of Poe, Defoe, and Washington Irving, a copy of Johnson's Buccaneers, the name of the dead man's chest from Kingsley's At Last, some recollections of canoeing on the high seas, and the map itself, with its infinite eloquent suggestion, made up the whole of my materials. It is perhaps not often that a map figures so largely in a tale, yet it is always important. The author must know his countryside, whether real or imaginary, like his hand, the distances, the points of the compass, the place of the sun's rising, the behavior of the moon, should all be beyond cavil. And how troublesome the moon is. I have come to grief over the moon in Prince Otto, and so soon as that was pointed out to me, adopted a precaution which I recommend to other men. I never write now without an almanac. With an almanac in the map of the country, in the plan of every house, either actually plotted on paper or already and immediately apprehended in the mind, a man may hope to avoid some of the grossest possible blunders. With the map before him, he will scarce allow the sun to set in the east, as it does in the Antiquary. With an almanac at hand, he will scarce allow two horsemen, journeying on the most urgent affair, to employ 6 days, from 3 a.m. Monday morning till late the Saturday night, upon a journey of, say, 90 or 100 miles, and before the week is out, and still on the same nags, to cover 50 miles in one day, as may be read at length in the novel Rob Roy. And it's certainly well, though far from necessary, to avoid such croppers. But it is my contention, my superstition, if you like, that who is faithful to his map and consults it, and draws from it his inspiration, daily and hourly, gains positive support, and not mere negative immunity from accident. The tale has a root there. It grows in that soil. It has a spine of its own behind the words. Better if the country is real and he has walked every foot of it and knows every milestone, but even with imaginary places, he will do well in the beginning to provide a map. As he studies it, relations will appear that he had not thought upon. He will discover obvious, though unsuspected, shortcuts and footprints for his messengers. And even when a map is not all the plot, as it was in Treasure Island, it will be found to be a mine of suggestion. Whether we regard life as a lane leading to a dead wall, a mere bag's end, as the French say, or whether we think of it as a vestibule or gymnasium where we wait our turn and prepare our faculties for some more noble destiny, whether we thunder in a pulpit or pule in little atheistic poetry books about its vanity and brevity, whether we look justly for years of health and vigor, or are about to mount into a bath chair as a step towards the hearse. In each of all of these views and situations, there is but one conclusion possible, that a man should stop his ears against paralyzing terror and run the race that is set before him with a single mind. No one surely could have recoiled with more heartache and terror from the thought of death than our respected lexicographer, and yet we know how little it affected his conduct, how wisely and boldly he walked, and in what a fresh and lively vein he spoke of life. Already an old man, he ventured on his Highland tour, and his heart, bound with triple brass, did not recoil before 27 individual cups of tea, As courage and intelligence are the two qualities best worth a man's cultivation, so it is the first part of intelligence to recognize our precarious estate in life, and the first part of courage to be not at all abashed before the fact, a frank and somewhat headlong carriage, not looking too anxiously before, not dallying in maudlin regret over the past, stamps the man who is well armored for this world. And not only well armored for himself, but a good friend and a good citizen to boot. We don't go to cowards for tender dealing. There is nothing so cruel as panic. The man who has the least fear for his own carcass has the most time to consider others. That eminent chemist who took his walks abroad in tin shoes and subsisted wholly upon tepid milk had all his work cut out for him in considerate dealings with his own digestion. So soon as prudence has begun to grow up in the brain, like a dismal fungus, it finds its first expression in a paralysis of generous acts. The victim begins to shrink spiritually. He develops a fancy for parlors with a regulated temperature and takes his morality on the principle of tin shoes and tepid milk. The care of one important body or soul becomes so engrossing that all the noises of the outer world begin to come thin and faint into the parlor with the regulated temperature, and the tin shoes go equally forward over blood and rain. To be overwise is to ossify, and the scruple-monger ends by standing stock still. Now the man who has his heart on his sleeve, in a good whirling weathercock of a brain, who reckons his life as a thing to be dashingly used and cheerfully hazarded, makes a very different acquaintance of the world, keeps all his pulses going true and fast, and gathers impetus as he runs, until, if he be running towards anything better than wildfire, he may shoot up and become a constellation in the end. Lord, look after his health. Lord, have a care of his soul, says he, and he has at the key of the position and swashes through incongruity and peril towards his aim. Death is on all sides of him with pointed batteries, and he is on all sides of all of us. Unfortunate surprises gird him round. Mim-mouthed friends and relations hold up their hands in quite a little elegiacal synod about his path. And what cares he for all this? Being a true lover of living, a fellow with something pushing and spontaneous in his inside, he must, like any other soldier, in any other stirring deadly warfare, push on at his best pace until he touch the goal. "A peerage or Westminster Abbey," cried Nelson in his bright, boyish, heroic manner. "These are great incentives, not for any of these, but for the plain satisfaction of living, of being about their business in some sort or other. Do the brave serviceable men of every nation tread down the nettle danger and pass flyingly over all the stumbling blocks of prudence. Think of the heroism of Johnson. Think of that superb indifference to mortal limitation that set him upon his dictionary and carried him through triumphantly until the end. Who, if he were wisely considerate of things at large, would ever embark upon any work much more considerable than a halfpenny postcard? Who would project a serial novel after Thackeray and Dickens had each fallen in mid-course? Who would find heart enough to begin to live if he dallied with the consideration of death? And after all, what a sorry and pitiable quibbling all this is, to forgo all the issues of living in a parlor with a regulated temperature, as if that were not to die 100 times over, and for 10 years at a stretch, as if it were not to die in one's own lifetime, and without even the sad immunities of death, as if it were not to die and yet be the patient spectators of our own pitiable change. The permanent possibility of sensation is preserved, but the sensations carefully held at arm's length, as if one kept a photographic plate in a dark chamber. It's better to lose health like a spendthrift than to waste it like a miser. It's better to live and be done with it than to die daily in the sick room. By all means, begin your book, even if the doctor does not give you a year, even if he hesitates about a month. Make one brave push and see what can be accomplished in a week. It is not only in finished undertakings that we ought to honor useful labor. A spirit goes out of the man who means execution, which outlives the most untimely ending. All who have meant good work with their whole hearts have done good work, although they may die before they have the time to sign it. Every heart that has beat strong and cheerfully has left a hopeful impulse behind it in the world and bettered the tradition of mankind. And even if death catch people like an open pitfall in mid-career, laying out vast projects and planning monstrous foundations, flushed with hope, in their mouths full of boastful language, if they should be at once tripped up and silenced, is there not something brave and spirited in such a termination? And does not life go down with a better grace, foaming in full body over a precipice, than miserably straggling to an end in sandy deltas? When the Greeks made their fine saying that those whom the gods love die young, I cannot help believing they had this sort of death also in their eye. For surely, at whatever age it may overtake the man, this is to die young. Death has not been suffered to take so much as an illusion from his heart. In the hot fit of life, a tiptoe on the highest point of being, he passes at a bound on to the other side. The noise of the mallet and chisel is scarcely quenched. The trumpets are hardly done blowing, when, trailing with him clouds of glory, this happy-starred, full-blooded spirit shoots into the spiritual land.